well. So just briefly, a little bit of background of today's talk. So I was fortunate to get one of the fairly competitive research grants by the Netherlands Organization for Scientific Research 2 years ago, the NWO fide scheme, for some of you that might be familiar with it, which basically gave me the opportunity to study the topic of crimmigration in the European Union, just to shorten it a little bit, for the period of 5 years. So I basically got money for 5 years to build a small research team and to look into these matters. So my talk today is drawing partially from research that precedes this particular grant proposal that was awarded, but also research that is part of this ongoing project. Which means that it's, like, for me also exciting to test out certain ideas based on the additional or the extra research that I've been doing. So just to give everybody the credit that they deserve, also this research is a collaboration that I do with different institutions. So my PhD students are co-supervised by colleagues from Border Criminologies, but the University of Oxford and the University of Oslo. So we are a big international research team. This project focuses on several European countries. So my previous research was an in-depth case study of the Netherlands, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later on in the talk. And it served more or less as a pilot study for this larger research project. So based on the findings of the Dutch case study, I decided to look into what I call intra-Schengen cross-border mobility more in depth. And in this project we're looking at the Netherlands, Germany, Poland, Austria, Belgium, France and Spain. So as you, like, if you know the map of the European Union, they're all connected, and there's a reason why I chose countries that are all connected, because I'm interested in the dynamics of what I call these border areas. So you have these physical borders that are not supposed to exist formally because we have the principle of free movement, but as I will talk more about in a moment, there's actually a lot going on around these internal borders, yet we speak of border areas to sort of avoid the fact that, we're actually performing border checks. So I'm looking at these border areas, and in these areas, these are the two leading questions that my PhD students and myself are trying to address. So one of them is focused mostly on getting a more clear grasp on what I would call the state perspective. So how is the state, how are law enforcement organizations, how are they operating, what are they doing in these border areas, and especially being a law and society person, I'm interested in, like, how do the practices that we observe in these border areas by these state officials, how do they relate to what the law, being European law or national law, what the law actually tells what they can do, or what the law actually says that they can or cannot do. So state perspective and a very non-state focus more on how do people and organizations living and operating in these border municipalities, how do they perceive, the craziness around migration and border control in Europe. So how do migrant communities that have been in these border regions forever, how do they perceive all of a sudden, like, stricter rules and regulations, stricter controls, etc., etc. And I'm more than happy in the Q&A or after the talk to talk more about the sub-projects of my PhD students, because they are now in the field in Poland, in Germany and in Spain collecting data on these different matters. But it's in the context of this project that I will be talking today. So I always like to start with this image. In 2013 I was fortunate to see a phenomenal exhibition by photographer Ignacio Evangelista, who put together an exhibition called After Schengen, Europe's Borders. Well, I guess everybody here is familiar with the Schengen Agreement, right? Yes? No? Yeah? Okay. So there aren't supposed to be intra-Schengen borders. So between two European countries there are no longer permanent border checks. So what you see here, you can read it, Achtung, Staatsgrenze. This is an image of a former German border checkpoint. Well, it looks almost like a little bit romantic, like the little house is overgrown, there's nobody there, there's a free pathway from whichever this country is into Germany, right? So 2013. I think it would be highly interesting if the photographer would redo his tour through Europe right now, because these are the images that are now the reality of intra-Schengen borders in Europe. So we see different examples from different countries, and basically illustrating that the idyllic picture that we saw on the previous slide is no longer the reality of Schengen in Europe, right? So to end with the last one, the Dutch military and border police, the Koninklijke Nederlandse Marechaussee, for those who speak Dutch. All countries have a form of intra-Schengen border control, and it is that particular type of control that has my interest. So I'm not so much focused on the external borders of Europe, not because I think that what's going on there doesn't deserve attention, but I think there are in fact a lot of researchers looking at, you know, like what is happening at the external borders, where this would be an image of, like Hungary, I think. But I am more interested in what's happening within the European Union, because there's this perception of openness, there's this perception of freedom of movement. But when we look very closely, not just closely at like what is happening on a practical level, but also when we look closely into the law, you actually see that the European Union was never meant to be open. So that's going to be my claim, a very pessimistic talk, I'm already warning you, but I think it's an important realization, especially I think it will be different in this particular setting, but what I notice, or what I have been noticing over the past decade in attending conferences in the United States, that a lot of people tend to idealize the European Union or Europe or the European institutions. You know, at least you guys have like this European judicial system in place. Yeah, we do, but it doesn't mean that it functions, right? It doesn't mean that it makes a difference. So I'm very skeptical, as you may see. So after Schengen, Europe's borders. SBC refers to the Schengen Border Code, so the legal framework that basically governs everything in relation to, or with regard to, border crossing and border controls in Europe. So Article 22 of that border code is completely in line with the 2013 image that we saw by the photographer. Internal borders may be crossed at any point without a border check on persons, irrespective of their nationality, being carried out. On the right-hand side of the image, you see a map of Europe with the red lines representing the borders that have been closed, or the borders where permanent border checks have been reinstalled after 2015. So in quite a lot of places you see that Article 22 is no longer a reality, because these countries have reinvoked permanent border checks based on, or for a number of reasons that I'll address in a moment. So you could say, well, that's interesting. You know, at least these countries are clear on closing their borders. Does it mean that nothing happens, like in the countries where they did not officially reinvoke border control? No, because those countries are probably doing something else, which we will talk about in a moment. So now comes a point where I'm going to read a part from a paper that I've actually been finishing over the past couple of weeks that ties into, it's a more theoretical reflection, I would say, that I would love to share with you on how we can look at what is happening in Europe. And it's a paper that will be published in a book that might be of interest to some of you. It should be published in 2020. It's called Trump, Brexit and Fortress Europe. And it will be published by Fordham University Press. And it's a collection of chapters by American and European scholars, all reflecting on immigration and border control in the light of crimmigration and nationalism. So I always like working with images. So on the upper hand we see trade and globalization, breaking away the borders because we want, like, the open market, free trade, etc. So globalization, basically doing away with boundaries, right? Getting rid of borders. whereas the lower part of the image reflects what is happening now. We are building walls, building new borders to deal with all these fears, all these phenomena that seem to cause fear and unease for nation states and for individuals. So these past 2 decades, the European Union has been hit by 2 so-called crises, and I will reflect upon the use of the word crises a little bit later on, but I'm using it intentionally right now. The financial or euro crisis of 2008 and the 2015-16, or still ongoing, migration crisis. Whereas both crises have fed into euro-sceptic sentiments, it is safe to say that the response to the financial crisis at least seemed to be somewhat coordinated and uniform, with the EU member states coming together to reinforce the monetary union through powerful new instruments and sacrificed control over their banking systems to save the euro. The opposite has been true with regard to EU member states' response to the so-called migration crisis. Driven by a logic of re-nationalization combined with the rise of xenophobia and identity politics, member states chose to sacrifice part of the functionality of the Schengen Agreement, also known as the Schengen Acquis, rather than limit their national decision-making on migration and asylum. By falling back on national measures such as border controls or fences to contain the inflows of migrants and asylum seekers, member states chose to limit and monitor the cross-border mobility of people, and pronouncements became commonplace asserting that the Schengen Agreement, widely considered to be one of the paramount achievements of the European Union and of European integration as such, was effectively dead. As Magdalena Kmak, a scholar from Finland, describes, a pressing urge seemed to be felt across the European Union to be able to distinguish between the good, the bad, and the ugly immigrant. The group of migrants entering the European Union since 2015 would fall into the latter category. Asylum seekers or undocumented migrants, a thoroughly unwelcome group of visitors, I quote, lumped together under one label, shunned by EU countries, which try to deter them by, among others, building physical obstacles at borders and introducing controls over their territory. Although the response to the 2015 crisis might seem extreme in terms of the measures that have been taken, as I will argue later on, when we really look closely at the early deliberations around the European Union and the Schengen Agreement in particular, we see that member states were never very enthusiastic about this agreement, and were pushing for what they called compensatory measures to sort of counterbalance the risks that doing away with border control would pose from the very early moments onwards. Where is my clicker? So, as Lene has observed, despite the fact that the acute crisis in Europe around migration seems to have ended, the EU received 43% fewer asylum applications in 2017 than it did in 2016, the sense of crisis around issues of migration is still deeply entrenched in public and political discourse, and most likely will remain so for the unforeseen future. In many EU member states, nationalism and identity politics have gained ground, and views that used to be broadly criticized as xenophobic have become commonplace. Populist political forces, as well as some mainstream politicians and media outlets, are benefiting from anxieties about migration and doing everything they can to keep them alive. Can we conclude that with the erosion of the principle of free movement, something fundamentally has been broken in the European Union? Or are we just finally seeing what has always been present underneath the surface? And if so, how do we move on from here? And let me, disclaimer, I'm a fan of the European Union. I think it's a good thing. So I'm not claiming that we should do away with it. I just think it's very prevalent and very necessary to you know, like be critical of what's going on and to acknowledge the fact that things aren't working, not in, at least not on the not everywhere. So I'm not vouching for the end of the European Union. Let it be clear. I think it's interesting when looking at, you know, like different ways in which we could try to explain what's going on. I think three, like when you look at the literature, three themes to me actually stand out as very important in taking into consideration to, and like sort of explain what's going on in Europe. Like how does a continent that has, as we all know, a very painful history with xenophobia, with racism, to the extent that, you know, like we have a hard time even using the word race in Europe. I'll talk more about that in a minute. So how does a continent with that history, with those sensitivities, all of a sudden seems to turn into, you know, like a continent where in different countries, we see Hungary, we see the Netherlands, we see Germany, we see Austria, we see Italy, where very extreme right political parties are quickly gaining traction and gaining ground. I think three themes need to be explored: globalization, nationalism and identity politics, I already mentioned it a couple of times, and what I've called, or what has been called the notion of crimmigration. So the ongoing merger of issues of crime control and migration control basically being lumped together. So globalization is seen to produce new sources of insecurity and challenges to the security of states in particular. Under conditions of globalization, the distinction between the domestic and the international is increasingly being blurred, along with the line between internal and external threats. Irregular migrants are emblematic of the hybrid threat, characterized as a threat both to national security and sovereignty and to safety and order inside the state. Borders and mobility policing are therefore inextricably connected to state sovereignty. This reflection around the link between sovereignty and control of individuals' mobility is particularly striking in the case of the European Union, and in particular in the case of the internal borders of the Schengen area. By policing the mobility brought about by the ongoing globalization of society, national and even local order and security regimes are created and shaped by national or local notions of social order and belonging. And this is where matters of state responses to globalization link with notions of nationalism. Nations and nationalism propagate a sense of shared identity, solidifying a distinctive cultural heritage and personality for a given named population. Consequently, nationalism is used to maintain distance from others. The nationalist community strives to preserve the land, culture, and language and political institutions in a certain way of life. Cultural differences are therefore being seen as a threat to the existing way of life, and is thus seen as a rationale to preserve one's culture through the exclusion of other cultural groups. Supposed cultural similarities and norms are grouped, necessitating the separation of those who are not seen to belong from those who are. According to Ibrahim, it is as a result of this obsession with cultural homogeneity that immigrants are linked with the demise of the nature, an attitude that should be understood as racism. Whereas, as I just said, in many European countries, as a result of the atrocities of the world wars, the term race is not openly used. I think it is important to say, and to acknowledge that it has been replaced by the term culture, and that the fear of cultural heterogeneity and the wish to preserve a certain core, in particular by societies in the global north. And culture just, it sounds less, I don't know, it sounds less bad as race, but like when you really look at what's going on, it's just trying to say the same but just in a slightly different way. And it's interesting, I think, when I speak for a European audience or in European settings, saying this out loud like sends shivers through an audience. Like, oh my gosh, she's using the word race. Like, that's not what we do here in Europe. But I think it's important to call it as it is. The same holds when, so I think I'm particularly interested in like the way in which discourse is being used to, like in the whole game of like othering and like in the whole political context of border control and migration control. Because when you look at the use of the crisis rhetoric in discussing what I would call migration tragedy in Europe, this fits in seamlessly with the strong nationalistic sentiments in Europe, as this rhetoric directly places an out-of-the-ordinary situation in a discourse that sees Europe as a continent under siege, a continent at war. And within this discourse, refugees and other migrants are ambivalently and sometimes interchangeably portrayed as victims and dangerous invaders, posing a threat to our safety, economic well-being, cultural identity, language, and values. Also, it's precisely through the idea of an invading outside that a distinguishable and coherent inside is being reaffirmed. Thus, the nation is brought forth as if it were a subject that must dramatically stage control over its borders in order to remain safe, prosperous, and pure. Insofar as nationalism propagates a national identity and an ideal of a territorially bound community, it functions as an attempt to combine standardized notions of belonging with the desire to expel and exclude. It dictates terms of welcome into the state through establishing of imaginary and physical borders. Significantly, both Carrington and Luik suggest that nationalist ideals thus support the enforcement of borders as they demarcate sovereign space. Related to this, Saskia Sassen notes that to give up control of territorial borders is to relinquish one powerful instrument in the production of national cultures, as borders mitigate social pluralization and therefore a political challenge to the hegemony of state-sanctioned modes of national existence. Nationalism thus supports the protection of territorially bound national communities and justifies the physical as well as the psychological exclusion of those perceived as different. So what I'm trying to illustrate here is like the link between nationalism and this focus on wanting to re-establish the intra-Schengen borders in the Schengen arena. The objectives of border control in many countries, both inside but also outside the European Union, are getting increasingly inscribed into discourses about crime and punishment and into everyday practices of contemporary penal regimes. This illustrates how countries are trying to revitalize national identity and keep out the foreign and culturally different, as I just argued, as well as to fend off those who wish to take claim on the resources and protect welfare rights for citizens, right? So because we see the scare of, like we see a crime scare in Europe, but also, you know, like fears of people taking advantage of the resources. Most predominantly, we see that in the Western European countries. The sorting between bona fide global citizens and the crimmigrant others by means of legal measures and practices is central to the growing body of scholarship on crimmigration, the merger of crime control and migration control. In this scholarship, or in this literature, again, the notion of borders is frequently discussed. Scholars have pointed out that the merging field of crimmigration control functions as a clear gatekeeper in terms of membership and access. On the one hand, this has resulted in borders seen as being everywhere, as a range of non-traditional social control agents are being pulled into the task of sorting between the deserving and the undeserving migrants. And on the other hand, physical borders seem to become again viewed as major tools of exclusion. And let me quote Rajaram and Grundy War here, major tools of exclusion that can be strengthened and fostered to protect a community and a society against a phantasmic threat of otherness that tends to become flesh in the demonized and abject figure of a migrant or a refugee. So it's pretty depressing so far, right? And I'm not sure if I can give it another term, but what I want to do right now for the last part of the lecture is, so what I've done now is sort of laid out the scope of like more common developments that you see in different European countries, right? Because this applies basically to a range of European countries, these dynamics, as I just said, with when you look at the elections, when you look at public opinion polls, you very much see a nationalistic drive and it being translated into actual election victories of these extreme right parties. As I said, as we've also seen, like borders are becoming more and more important, which is at odds with that principle of free movement. So let us look into that a little bit further, because as I said at the very beginning, you know, it's very easy when you look into the now and when you would just look at what has been happening in Europe since 2015 to see it as a very extreme moment in the history of the Union, right? Like as a very odd moment. But, and I'm going to skip this for a little bit, these are just illustrations of the notion of crimmigration. But actually when you look at the history of the European Union, I already alluded to it, and especially at the deliberations that are at the foundation of the Schengen Agreement, we can see that none of the countries that originally signed the Schengen Agreement and none of them that followed a little bit later on were very enthusiastic about this whole idea of no longer being able to perform border controls between two Schengen countries. Right? They saw very much the monetary benefits, so the trade benefits, as the illustration just showed, you know, it being more easier to trade between different European countries. But every country said, well, but what about cross-border crime, and what about migration? Like, if there's nobody there to check what's going on, like, how do we know who is actually entering into the country? Like, shouldn't we have some sort of escape? Like, if there's a feeling that something's up, that at least we can do something. Of course, the whole idea was to give up intra-Schengen controls because the external border checks would be so buffed up that none of that would be necessary, right? Like, within the continent. But still, that was not convincing for most countries. So what we see is that when we look at the Schengen Border Code, we see that the Border Code is interesting in the sense that only one article speaks or illustrates the principle of free movement. That's the article that I just showed, Article 22. The rest of the code is only about giving rules and regulations that actually do allow countries to temporarily reintroduce permanent border checks or have these spot checks. So I am not going to talk about the Article 25 and 28, which were the red lines that I just showed in the image of Europe. So countries that have said, we are reintroducing permanent border checks, which basically means no one is able to enter into the country without being checked. Everybody will be checked. So reintroducing the checkpoints, basically. What I'm going to talk about is an article that has for a long time been extremely understudied, Article 23. Article 23 says that every country can perform, and they are not using the word Schengen proof, that's my own invention, but that every country can carry out spot checks in a certain area, and it differs per country, like what the width is of that area. We can carry out spot checks around internal borders as long as they don't have border control as an objective, as long as they're spot checks, so not everybody is being checked, as long as they're based on general police information and experience regarding possible threats to public safety, and devised and executed in a manner clearly distinct from systematic checks on persons at the external border. This is why I love law, because you see like a seemingly super clear article, but when you read it closely, it's extremely vague, right? Because cannot have border control. So does that mean that it has to be put in writing? Is it just sufficient when you say, oh, well, this is just a police check, or this is just an immigration check? What does this mean? General police information? Does it mean that they can only be information based, or based on risk assessment? But this is what the Border Code says. There are no underlying memorandums of explanation. So it's left up to the member states to translate this into national law, or not, because it's a code, so it's not necessary to translate it into national legislation. So I was intrigued by this because you can see there's a lot of discretion, right? Discretion left up to the national legislature. Are we actually going to transform this and translate this into national law? But also discretion on the level of the organizations that are tasked with performing these types of checks. So I looked into the case study of the Netherlands. And this is a little bit older research, where it's like 3 years old. I did it with 2 other PhD students. We spent about 800 hours in the field with the military and border police, observing their everyday performance of these types of checks. So we focused only on the brigades along the land borders with Germany and Belgium that were responsible for carrying out these types of checks. And in the Netherlands, these checks were called the Mobile Aliens Monitor. It's a horrible name, but this is it. And it's the Dutch interpretation of Article 23. So what's interesting is that when you look at the national foundation or the national basis of the checks in the Dutch law, it's based on the Vreemdelingenwet, the Aliens Decree, or Vreemdelingenbesluit, which means that these checks are meant to be immigration checks. So not police checks, immigration checks, for which it's not necessary, because it's not police checks, not criminal law based, there's no reasonable suspicion. So anybody who enters into the Netherlands by car or walking or by train can be subjected to these checks. And the checks would be a person, like a military and border patrol official, asking you for valid identification. Because the aim or the goal of these types of checks, when they were implemented, was to prevent illegal entry and irregular stay. Later on, in 2006, something was added to this goal, which is interesting in the light of what I mentioned around crimmigration. So this is very much immigration control. From 2006 onwards, we see still prevent illegal entry and irregular stay, as well as human smuggling and identity fraud as forms of migration-related crimes. So from a legal point of view, this is where it becomes very messy. Because what does that mean? Like, does it give different types of powers depending on with what aim you are performing a check? Both immigration and crime control. So in the Netherlands, the limitation is in the 20-kilometer area around the border, which is still pretty close to the border. A limited hours per day, 6 hours per day, and I think 90 hours per week. Different countries have slightly different rules. And I will not get into all of the details. I'm more than happy to share papers that have been written based on this fieldwork, which was intriguing. But what I want to share with you, because I always like working with some of the quotes, are just some quotes that we've collected in the field, and then tell you a little bit around it. So at first, I said the original name of this way to check people was the Mobile Aliens Monitor. We found out that around 2006, 2007, the same year in which the aim of the checks was slightly widened, they started to use the name the Mobile Security Monitor. And I was like, that's interesting. Does that mean that all of a sudden there are, you know, like criminal powers or criminal investigative powers that these military and border police officials have? Asked around, looked into the documentation, nobody could actually tell me why the name had been changed, other than that it sounded a little bit better. Because, yeah, you know, like, we're the military, we don't want to be just affiliated with migration control. We're here, we're standing literally at the frontiers of the Netherlands, what I would hear, and we're the first line of defense, literal quote. So, of course we're about security. And, like, let's be honest, and this is not me talking, but based on the many hours of interviewing and, you know, informal chatting I did, they're like, let's be honest, like most of these migrants are involved with some form of criminality anyway. So security just covers it all. In the field, this was actually causing a lot of confusion for the men and women that were tasked with these checks. And this is a quote: "We're located in these border areas and the name is Mobile Security Monitor. We are the first ones to guarantee the security of the Netherlands. That's the focus of our organization. And if that's your target, to monitor the security in the Netherlands, while on the other hand also saying that I cannot use my powers to combat crime because that's not why I'm here. Well, hello, I need to know who is entering my country, entering the country. I need to create a secure situation, which is my task, isn't it? So this officer and I were talking about the name, and I was telling him, like, well, you know, or I was asking him, do you actually know what the legal mandate is upon which you can operate? He's like, yeah, I know, it's only immigration law. So basically, when I see a car crossing the border and I think that there might be drugs in there, I am not entitled to do anything, because that is not within my jurisdiction. I can only pull over cars which I think are an issue in the light of migration control. Two other quotes. Maybe officially we're not allowed to exceed our powers. When their paperwork is in order, so people that are being checked, we technically have to let them go. Which is strange to me, since we're there to monitor the security of our country. Why talk about security if you cannot submit someone to a complete check? Since they started, so they being the higher managerial levels of the military and border police, since they started talking about mobile security monitor, I no longer feel the need to respect the restrictions of the aliens decree. In order to maintain security, I can do whatever I want in the border area. I can just stop everyone who gives me the feeling that something's wrong and turn them inside out. It is just black and white like that. Well, these are, you know, just 3 examples from many more, which basically show how the blurring of the boundaries between migration control and crime control against the backdrop of a you know, like a more like social, like national, but also European nationalist tendency around migration are really affecting the people that are in the field performing these, you know, like these different types of border checks that are not supposed to be called border checks, but in fact they are, and are the first people that interact with potential refugees or people in need. Last set of quotes, and then I'll wrap up to leave enough time for questions. Besides seeing how you know, like the legal framework was being misused by mixing migration control with crime control, we also like collected so many examples of what I've called, for the sake of this slide, crimmigrant stereotyping. So the association of certain ethnic groups with different forms of crime, which was quite striking and very hard to listen to most of the times. But I'm just going to share some examples with you anyways. If you catch Moroccans, just to give a random example, then you know that there's a chance of finding drugs. When encountering a person from Lithuania, to name another random country, I think it's very funny that they are like random, but it's obviously not random, there might be the chance of finding stolen property. Every group has its own specific crimes. Not just very disturbing for the natural link that it seems to be made between people from a certain country and certain crimes, but also in the light of the fact that crime control is not the main objective of why they are there. I think that there's just evidence that if you say human trafficking, those are Bulgarians. It's just like that. When you see a Romanian driving in a car with an Italian license plate, then you know something is wrong. So never rent a car with a different license plate. They only drive through Europe to commit crimes, and that shows. We find so many false Romanian passports. And this last guy, I'm enforcing the Aliens Act, aren't I? That means if I have to choose between a Dutch vehicle with a nice family in it, or a French car with 5 Somali people, it's an easy choice. And, you know, as I said, thousands and thousands of quotes, which is very disturbing for, you know, like multiple reasons that I'm not even, like, that I won't list all when I'm here, while I'm here, but it's very hard to sort of reason, right? Like, because to reason with the officers, with the street level officers that are operating in these border areas, that are operating with these very strong, deeply embedded, not just personal stereotypes, but I would even say organizational stereotypes, because of the lack of education, because of the lack of training, and because of the lack of reflection on what it is that they're doing, and because of the fact that there is not enough capacity, there's not enough money, so they're operating under high pressure, But while doing so, that can never be a justification for making these extremely problematic choices, because of course, like when this is the lens through which you look at the population crossing these borders, this is what you will find, right? Because you're very much focused on basically finding the evidence for the fact that these groups are the groups that you're looking at. What is more problematic is that these checks have not been evaluated. Why? I know why, because I've done the research. It's extremely time consuming, right? Because if you really want to get a clear insight into how decision-making processes, because that's actually what you're looking into, how they work, you need to spend so much time in the field. And that's time-consuming, very expensive, and it's not something that can be done easily. But what I find problematic is that despite the fact that there have been growing concerns and which have been voiced by NGOs, but also by scholars in Europe with regard to racial profiling happening, especially in the context of these highly discretionary and vague checks, that the European Commission basically says in this long quote, we don't like countries to re-invoke permanent border checks, because we think that's maybe a bit too excessive in the light of the principle of free movement. So we advise countries to use their national law, hence Article 23 checks, to basically monitor what is happening in their border area. So the European Commission is pushing for countries to use these types of checks without offering more clarity with regard to what they actually can and cannot do. So to wrap up, as part of my current project, as I said, I've been scoping out to finding out what's happening in other countries. And I was able to send out a query through the European Migration Network. They sent out a short questionnaire to all member states that was aimed to figure out to what extent they are using Article 23, and if so, which institutions are involved, what the legal basis is, etc., etc. And I'm more than happy to share the summary of that query with anybody who would be interested in it. But basically all countries are using Article 23. Some of them are very clear about it and just saying that. Others are describing their national practices, and then it's clear from the description that it's actually their translation or interpretation of Article 23. But different organizations are involved. They're all a mixture of crime control and migration control. Some of them are being performed by the military, others by more police organizations. It's basically a mess. There's no clarity, there's no line, there's no unity, let alone harmonization. So it's a big mess with regard to the internal border checks in Europe. So to wrap up, and I think I've said a lot about it already, like in the beginning of the talk. I'm very skeptical with regard to like the foundation of the principle of free movement. I think that free movement has always been intended only for a very specific group of people in the European Union, but that because of like the history of the continent, that has never been made as explicit. And I think as a result of that, and as a result of like international crime, international terrorism, people becoming more fearful, all of a sudden now all these anxieties and very ugly feelings are coming to the fore and are surfacing. But we haven't developed a language to talk about it, as a result of which people tend to freeze, and there's not an actual exchange of thoughts and communication about these measures. And I'm personally a bit disappointed in like what's being done on a supranational, so on the European level, to try to at least iron out some of these things. As the Article 20, or as the case of the Netherlands has showed, is basically in line with what I just said. Like Article 23 has been in the Schengen Border Code from the very, very beginning, basically giving all countries sort of like a loophole if they are like to continue keeping dominance over their border area, to continue the feel of having like ownership over this sovereign space by performing these spot checks. But when we look at these spot checks, they are falling in line with the exclusionary measures and exclusionary dynamics that we see all through Europe. that's it. I think.